They dragged the calabash into the square and smashed it before the moon could climb clear of the clouds. The sound split the night, not loud, sharp, like a bone breaking where everyone could hear it. Someone screamed. It might have been her. It might have been a child waking from sleep. No one turned to check. Ash was thrown first, then water, then words that should never be spoken after sunset. "Say it again," a voice demanded, an elder's voice, dry and shaking with anger that had waited too long. She stood barefoot in the dust, wrists trembling, cloth torn at the shoulder. Her eyes searched faces that refused to meet them. Neighbors she had greeted at dawn, women who had shared salt with her, men who had once laughed in her doorway. "Say it," the elder repeated, "so the night can hear you." The crowd pressed closer, forming a ring that felt older than the village itself. Someone spat near her feet. Someone else laughed too loudly and then stopped. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. A gourd horn sounded from the edge of the square, one short breath, then silence. Dogs began to howl in the distance, not in fear, but in confusion, as if answering a call that had no voice. The elder lifted his staff and struck the ground 3 times. She has done it, whether she admits it or not. A murmur rolled through the people, relief mixed with dread. It is easier, after all, when blame has a shape. The elder nodded to the men behind him. "Speak her name," he commanded. The name fell from many mouths at once, uneven. Some shouted, some whispered, some bitten off halfway as if they burned the tongue. At the sound of it, the wind moved, not strong, just enough to stir the ash back into their faces. A woman at the edge of the square clutched her stomach and bent over, retching. A baby began to cry and would not stop. The moon slid free of the clouds at last, pale and watchful, illuminating the smashed calabash and the dark liquid soaking into the earth. She finally spoke then, not her name, not a plea. "It wasn't finished," she said. No one asked what she meant. The elder raised his hand for silence, but the square was already quiet, too quiet. Even the insects had stilled, as if listening. "Take her away," he said, "before dawn hears this place." As they pulled her toward the path that led beyond the last huts, she looked back once, not at the elder, not at the crowd, at the ground, at the broken calabash, at the place where something had been poured out and could not be gathered again. By morning, the village acted as if the night had never happened. Smoke rose from hearths. Mortars struck grain in steady rhythm. Children chased one another between compounds, their laughter sharp and careless. If anyone noticed the faint smear of dark liquid still staining the center of the square, they stepped around it without comment. This was how Koroko survived its own fear, by agreeing, without speaking, not to remember too much at once. Koroko sat where the red earth hardened into stone, ringed by thorn trees and a river that only respected the rains when it felt like it. The rules here were old and simple. You greeted elders before the sun reached its height. You did not fetch water after the 3rd drum at night. You did not speak certain names aloud unless you wanted answers you could not control. And you did not ask what happened to people taken away before dawn. By midday, the elder who had raised his staff the night before sat beneath the udala tree, chewing kola nut as if nothing weighed on his chest. When questioned, quietly, carefully, he said only, "Balance was disturbed. Balance has been addressed." No one pressed him. They all knew whose balance he meant. She had not always been an outcast. That was the uncomfortable truth many tried to swallow with their food and failed.
She had been there long before the whispers began, long before the goats refused to enter her compound, before the river took one child and spared another, before men began to lower their voices when she passed. She had come to the village with nothing but a small bundle and a quiet way of looking at people, as if she were listening to something behind their words. The elders had allowed her to stay because she was useful. She knew roots, she knew fever, she knew how to stop bleeding when the moon was thin. People are generous when they need you, but generosity changes when need turns into fear. By afternoon, the women gathered near the grinding stones began to talk, not about her directly, never that, but about other things that pointed in her direction. About how crops had grown uneven this season, about how a certain man's wealth had increased too quickly, about how some people asked too many questions of the old ways. A young girl paused in her work and asked, "Will she come back?" Her mother struck her lightly on the mouth. "Do not pull the night toward you," she warned. Still, one question remained unspoken, sitting heavy beneath every conversation. If what was done last night was right, why did it not feel finished? As the sun lowered, a boy tending goats noticed something strange. One of the animals stood apart from the rest, staring toward the path beyond the village, the path she had been dragged down, its ears stiff, its body unmoving. No matter how much the boy shouted or threw stones, the goat did not turn away. By evening, the wind returned, and this time it did not bring relief.
On the third day, the jokes began. They always did. Fear, when left unattended, rots into humor sharp enough to cut. Men laughed louder than usual at the palm wine stand. Women mimicked her walk when they thought no one important was watching. Someone claimed to have found a charm buried near her old doorway and waved an ordinary pebble in the air until people gasped and leaned closer. "See," he said, "I told you she was hiding something." No one asked why the pebble looked exactly like the hundreds scattered across the paths of Koroko. Children were the cruelest, though they did not know they were being cruel. They played a new game that afternoon, chasing one another and shouting her name, daring the others to repeat it without stumbling. Each time a child tripped or fell, the others shrieked with laughter, convinced they had witnessed proof. Proof of what? None of them could explain. Yet not everyone laughed easily. A man named Daramola, once respected, now merely tolerated, sat apart from the others and drank in silence. He had lost his first wife to fever years before, despite her careful obedience to every rule the village claimed to honor. He knew how quickly people rewrote history when it suited them. "You speak her name too freely," he muttered, when a youth leaned close, breath thick with wine. The youth scoffed. "Are you afraid she will hear from wherever she crawled to?" Daramola did not answer. He was watching the sky. Clouds gathered in a way he did not like, not heavy, not promising rain, but thin and layered, moving against the wind as if pulled by something unseen. Across the village, small things began to go wrong. A cooking pot cracked without falling. Palm wine soured before sunset. A woman swore she felt fingers brush her ankle while drawing water, though she stood alone. Each incident by itself meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to finish tracing. That night, laughter drifted longer than usual, as if noise could keep something at bay. But when the drums finally stopped, an unease settled over Koroko like a second skin. In his sleep, Daramola dreamed of a calabash, whole, unbroken, floating on the river upstream. Inside it, something knocked, slow and patient. When he woke before dawn, his mouth tasted of ash, and the knocking had followed him into the waking world. From somewhere beyond the village, a sound came, soft,
hollow, unmistakable, as if something empty was being gently tapped from the inside.
The knocking stopped by sunrise. That, more than the sound itself, unsettled those who had heard it. If it had continued, they could have argued about it, blamed goats, blamed wind, blamed sleep. But its sudden absence left a hollow space that explanation could not easily fill. At the river, the fishermen noticed the first sign. Fish floated near the surface, not dead, not gasping, simply still, as if waiting. When nets were cast, they slipped through without struggle, their bodies cold in the hand, despite the warming day. One man dropped his catch and muttered a prayer under his breath, then laughed it off too quickly. "It is nothing," he said. "The water is only tired." By mid-morning, birds gathered on rooftops where they did not usually perch. They faced the same direction, heads tilted, watching the path beyond the village. No matter how stones were thrown, they returned minutes later, patient and silent. A woman sweeping her compound found her broom snapped cleanly in two, not frayed, not worn, broken as if cut. She stared at it for a long time before quietly burning it. No one called a meeting. No elder struck the ground with his staff. Each person carried their unease alone, folding it into daily tasks, careful not to let it show. Only a child spoke plainly. He tugged at his grandmother's wrapper and asked, "Why is the ground listening today?" She slapped his hand away and told him not to say foolish things. Still, as the sun climbed, many felt it, the sensation that their footsteps lingered too long, that the earth held sound instead of releasing it. By evening, the goats refused to drink, and somewhere beyond Koroko, unseen and unnamed, something that had been poured out began to remember its shape. The village settled, not into peace, but into habit. Markets opened on time. Debts were argued over with familiar bitterness. A naming ceremony went ahead as planned, drums thudding confidently into the night as if rhythm alone could command order. Visitors passed through Kóroko and left with no story worth repeating. For a while, it almost worked. People told themselves that whatever discomfort lingered was simply the residue of excitement, the echo of a dramatic night given more weight than it deserved. Humans are skilled at surviving by shrinking their attention. Weeks passed. Yams swelled in the ground. Rain arrived when expected, if a little heavier than usual. The river stayed within its banks. Even the elders relaxed, their conversations drifting back toward disputes of land and marriage instead of balance and consequence. Only small inconveniences remained, easy to dismiss. A pot misplaced and found again in the wrong compound. Footprints near the square in the early morning, bare, too light, vanishing where the ground should have recorded them. A child born with eyes that did not cry immediately, but stared, long and searching, before finally closing. Life continued, and that continuity bred confidence. The elder beneath the udala tree began to speak of the night less carefully. "These things happen," he said. "The village stands. That is what matters." People nodded, grateful for permission to relax. And yet, comfort has a way of dulling caution. One afternoon, a group of young men repaired the fence near the square. As they worked, they uncovered something shallowly buried in the dust, a fragment of calabash, its edge blackened, its surface etched with marks none of them could read. They stared at it in silence. Finally, one of them laughed and kicked dirt over it. "Old trash. Why let broken things trouble us?" The others agreed, quickly, eagerly. That night the drums played longer than they had in months, and far upstream the river carried something whole, something patient, closer to Koroko with every quiet turn. It was not an elder who warned them.
It was not a priest, nor a diviner, nor any man whose words carried weight by tradition. It was a widow. She had lost so much already that the village had grown used to the shape of her grief. Her hut stood slightly apart, as if sorrow were contagious. People greeted her out of politeness, not respect. On the morning she spoke, the air felt thick, unmoving. Even before her voice rose, several women glanced around, uneasy. "This place is not clean," the widow said. Conversations faltered, grinding stones slowed. She did not shout, she did not accuse. That, perhaps, was why her words unsettled those who heard them. What was poured out was not meant to be emptied. What was broken was not finished holding. A man laughed from the shade. "You speak like someone who wants attention." The widow turned toward him, eyes steady. "I speak like someone who remembers." She told them of a dream, of walking to the river and seeing a calabash floating upstream, moving against the current, of hearing knocking from inside it, of waking with wet feet, though her mat was dry. Some shifted uncomfortably, others rolled their eyes. "Dreams are only dreams," an elder said, irritated. "Do you want us to reopen what has already been sealed?" The widow shook her head. Nothing was sealed. That was when the mockery sharpened. They called her lonely. They called her bitter. They told her grief had softened her mind. A boy mimicked her trembling hands until his mother dragged him away by the ear. The widow looked at them one last time. "Then listen carefully," said the widow. "When it comes, it will not ask who is guilty. It will only ask who remembers." She turned and walked back to her hut. No one followed. No one argued further. By sunset, her warning had already begun to fade, replaced by the comfort of noise and routine. That night, the knocking returned. Closer this time, and no one laughed.
The first loss arrived quietly, the way serious things often do. At dawn, a farmer named Bamidele went to his field and found his yams standing upright above the soil, roots exposed, arranged carefully in a line, as if someone had lifted them during the night and set them back down wrong. Not eaten, not stolen, simply removed from where they belonged. He stood there for a long time, scratching his head, trying to make sense of it. When he finally told his neighbors, they laughed and said goats must have been restless. But goats tear, they do not arrange. 2 days later, a child developed a fever that did not follow the usual rules. It did not rise, it did not fall. It sat in the body, steady and patient, eyes open, watching. When herbs were given, the child swallowed obediently and grew weaker. The woman who would once have been called to help was gone. By the end of the week, 3 households reported missing things: a bracelet inherited from a grandmother, a carved stool used only during festivals, a bundle of cowries tied and hidden years ago for a future bride. None were replaced, none were found. People began to speak more softly. Then the river changed. Not its level, not its color, its sound. Those who fetched water in the early morning swore the river no longer flowed forward. It whispered instead, as if something within it were being turned slowly in circles. When calabashes were dipped, the water inside them trembled even after being set down. An elder tried to perform a small ritual, nothing dramatic, nothing public. He poured palm wine at the edge of the square and spoke the old words meant to calm unsettled ground. The wine soaked in. The words did not. That night, a wealthy man woke to find his storehouse empty. Not looted, empty. Even the dust had been swept away, leaving the walls clean and accusing. By morning, there was no more pretending.
Fear moved openly now from compound to compound, slipping into conversations, sitting beside people as they ate. Mothers held children too tightly. Men argued over nothing and everything. And in the center of the square, the dark stain where the calabash had been broken had deepened as if fed from below. Still, no one spoke her name. They did not need to. Something was answering anyway.
Anger found Koroko before reason could. It started small. A goat was slaughtered for nothing. A boy accused another boy of stealing a bracelet that had simply disappeared. Voices rose at the market. Spittle flew. Windows slammed. Huts were locked too tightly, as if the walls themselves could hold out evil. They looked for someone to hold responsible, someone to hang shame upon. The widow was first. Her warnings had made her different, and difference is easy to hate. Children whispered when she passed, and women avoided her gaze. She was called mad. Better a fool than a curse, someone muttered. Then came the strangers, travelers who had paused at the river weeks before. They were asked questions in sharp, suspicious tones. No answer was satisfactory. They left hurriedly, the air between them and the villagers electric with accusation. Finally, even the quietest were accused. The healer who had once treated fevered bodies, the farmer who had whispered to his crops, the men and women who did nothing, all felt eyes turn on them. "It is her," someone said. "It must be." "No, him," another countered. "Didn't he carry the calabash once?" Voices overlapped, shadows crossed faces, the square filled with trembling hands and pointing fingers. But the loss continued. The fevered child did not recover. The river whispered in circles. Items vanished. Even the birds gathered in the same place each evening, silent and patient. The villagers' anger did nothing. It only made the fear heavier. That night, doors were bolted. Fires burned higher than usual, and the calabash fragment remained in the center of the square. It had returned, and for the first time, people noticed the tapping. Slow, patient, unseen. A sound that did not belong to any human, yet answered every accusation with perfect silence.
It began with dreams. One by one, villagers saw her, though not her body, only her presence. A shadow at the corner of the hut, a pair of eyes glowing faintly in the dark, a whisper that seemed carried by the wind just beneath the ear. The dreams repeated nightly, not stories, only moments. A hand reaching out, a calabash overturned, footsteps pacing the square. No one spoke, no one laughed. Sleep became a currency they could not afford. Rituals that had once worked failed spectacularly. The elder poured libations, spoke words from memory, waved leaves and smoke, and nothing changed. The river did not bow. The earth did not release what it held. Symbols began to appear, small, precise, almost invisible. A line etched into a hut post, a circle in the dust, a single feather balanced on a fence. Each one alone meant nothing. Together they unsettled. Families huddled, yet still the unseen did not strike in grand gestures. It whispered, moved, waited. A single voice could hear it, and by the time they told another, doubt had swallowed half their certainty. Even children began to speak in pauses, afraid to finish sentences. One girl, brushing her hair at dawn, heard a soft knock on her window. She turned. Nothing. The knock came again. Her reflection trembled back at her. People stopped looking outward. They stopped reaching for answers in others. They stared at themselves, at each other, at the spaces in between, wondering if the unseen was something inside them or something they could not imagine outside. And in the square, The calabash fragment pulsed faintly in the moonlight, as if breathing. No one touched it. No one needed to. It had begun moving on its own.
It was a man's greed that broke the fragile balance. He had watched the losses, the whispers, the slow terror that spread through Koroko, and instead of fear, he felt opportunity. A wealthy trader, clever and ruthless, he thought he could reclaim what was lost and profit further. Under the cover of night, he approached the square with fire in one hand and a knife in the other. The calabash fragment sat in the center, pulsing faintly, untouched for weeks. He did not hesitate. He struck first with the knife, slicing at the edges, then raised the fire to burn what remained. Sparks leapt, smoke swirled. The fragment resisted, humming faintly, but the man pressed on, shouting curses at the night. The moment the calabash cracked, the wind froze, the moon seemed to stall, and from somewhere beyond the village, a low, steady knocking answered his violence. He dropped both fire and knife, but it was too late. A silence unlike any before fell. No animals called, no river whispered. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Villagers came running, drawn by the noise of struggle, only to find the square empty, except for the man, shaking, and the calabash fragment, split now into 3 pieces. He fell to his knees, begging, cursing, screaming. No one moved to help. And then it began. The losses returned faster than before. Wealth vanished, crops wilted, water ran thin in the river. Those who had mocked, who had ignored warnings, who had laughed, they felt a cold pressing down on them, tightening around hearts and throats alike. The man's hands trembled, not from fear alone, but because he had destroyed something sacred without knowing what it was. And for the first time, everyone understood. Nothing could undo what had been done. The unseen had entered fully, and it remembered everything.
Then there was nothing. No wind, no whispers, no footsteps. The villagers stood in the square, looking at the broken calabash fragments, the blackened earth, and the trembling man. Their mouths were open, but no sound came. Even the children, who had once played and shouted without care, clutched at their mother's skirts, wide-eyed. For a long moment, longer than anyone could measure, time itself seemed to hesitate. The river ceased its murmurs. The birds did not stir. Dogs crouched silently in the shade, ears flat. The man who had broken the calabash sat on the earth, staring at nothing. He did not speak, could not move, as if the weight of the unseen pressed directly onto his bones. No one called him by name. No one offered comfort. The widow appeared at the edge of the square, her eyes scanning the crowd without fear. She said nothing, she only watched. And then, slowly, the villagers began to notice what had shifted. Not the missing items, not the sick child, not the river, not even the wind. Something deeper had changed. A pause so complete that every heart in Koroko felt the hollow of it. The silence hung, patient and watchful, demanding acknowledgement before anything could continue. It was a silence that would last far longer than any drumbeat, longer than any whispered prayer. And in that silence they understood. The night had not yet finished with them.
The truth arrived slowly, as all truths do in Kóroko. It began in memory. The elder who had raised his staff that night remembered her differently than he had wanted to. Not an outcast, not a thief, not a threat. She had been the guardian, the one entrusted with balance, holding what no one else could. The widow saw it in visions, the calabash, once broken, spilling not evil, but something meant to protect the village, something ancient, something patient. The man who had struck it felt it in every trembling limb. He had destroyed not a fragment, but a promise. And the unseen, which had waited quietly, began to unfold its verdict. One by one, the villagers remembered the subtle signs they had ignored: the goat that refused to drink, the child who watched without crying, the whispering river. All of it had been a warning, a test. They remembered her face in glimpses, her quiet way of noticing what others missed, her hands always folded in preparation, her eyes tracking things beyond the eye. And they realized blame had been a distraction, anger had been a distraction, greed had been the crack through which the unseen entered fully. The truth was not simple. It was not a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It was layered, hidden in patience and silence. Kóroko had survived because it had been watched. It had suffered because it had ignored, and it would carry both for the rest of its days. Not everyone was forgiven. Some bore guilt too deep to name. Some carried shame as though it were flesh. And yet, from memory to memory, from whisper to whisper, the story took form. The village could see what they had not before, but understanding came too late to undo the consequences.
Even after the truth was known, Koroko did not return to what it had been. The river flowed again, but its current felt heavier, slower, as if remembering the weight of nights past. Crops grew, but unevenly, as if the earth itself hesitated to fully trust the hands that planted it. Children played, but fewer laughed freely. Their games carried the echo of caution, the whisper of the unseen, and the memory of a calabash broken by human greed. The man who had destroyed the calabash never smiled again. He worked in silence, carrying shame like a stone tied to his chest. Some villagers avoided him. Others watched him, a living warning of what happens when curiosity and desire outrun respect. The widow, for all her foresight, remained apart. No one mocked her anymore, but neither did they approach her with warmth. She had spoken truths they were not ready to fully embrace, and her words would outlive their comfort. Even the elders felt the change. Their authority, once unquestioned, had been tested. They continued to speak, but always with a caution born of fear that history could repeat itself if they faltered. Yet some balance returned. People remembered her, the one who had held the calabash, the one whose presence had contained what they could not control. They planted seeds with care, whispered prayers over water, and treated the wind with respect. The village had survived, but at a cost: innocence, certainty, and the easy laughter of yesterday. Koroko was alive, but it was different. Wiser, yes, but also haunted. And the air itself carried a lesson that could not be ignored. Even when the sun shone, the shadow of what had been broken lingered, and the villagers, those who remained, knew it. The days stretched long and still. Life returned to routines, but they were quieter now. Markets operated, but voices carried a careful edge. Children ran, but rarely shouted. Even laughter was measured, clipped, as though the air itself might carry consequences too heavy to bear. The calabash fragments were gathered and buried beneath the udala tree. No one touched them again. People walked past the spot with reverence, or perhaps with fear. The widow tended her garden, silent and steady. Her warnings had been heeded too late, but her presence reminded Koroko that caution was not weakness, it was survival. Rivers were watched more closely. Crops were planted with rituals performed in small, private gestures, and the elders spoke less of authority and more of respect for the old ways. Yet beneath all the order, a quiet unease remained. Some nights the river whispered differently. Some mornings shadows shifted against the sun, and sometimes, far beyond the village paths, a faint tapping echoed, slow, patient, and waiting. Koroko had learned that some lessons cannot be forgotten, some balances cannot be restored fully, and some memories endure in ways no ritual can erase. The village was alive, yes, but always with an eye toward what might return if they were careless. The air itself seemed to hold a memory of the broken calabash, and the villagers respected it in ways they could not fully explain. From that day, the village learned that some names are never safe to speak, and some silences must never be broken.
Every story hides a lesson, sometimes love, sometimes pain, but always truth. Subscribe to African Kingdom Folktales for more African tales that touch the soul.